The rain fell in endless gray sheets, turning the city into a watercolor painting of bleeding neon and blurred headlights. Inside the cocoon of the armored sedan, the world was a distant hum. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was a metronome counting out the seconds of a life Jack Costello no longer felt he was living. He was merely observing it from behind layers of bulletproof glass and hardened steel. The car was a fumway, a very comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless. It moved through the arteries of a city he owned, yet he was stuck in its traffic, a king imprisoned by his own kingdom's congestion. He leaned his head against the cool window, the faint vibration of the engine a familiar companion. His gaze was empty, sweeping over the crowded West End street without really seeing. He saw shapes, people huddled under awnings, a bus spewing diesel fumes, the frantic dance of umbrellas. It was all just scenery. His mind was miles away, dissecting a conversation with Leo, his consigliere, about a shipping route dispute. It was a world of numbers, logistics, and quiet threats. A world of control. Here, in this gridlock, he had none. The irony was not lost on him. His eyes drifted. He traced the path of a single raindrop as it zigzagged down the glass, joining a dozen others in a pool at the bottom. He noticed the heavy gold of the Costello family ring on his pinky finger, the wolf's head insignia worn smooth by generations of ambition and consequence. He rotated it slowly, a habit he fell into when his thoughts turned inward. The ring felt heavier tonight. It always did when the loneliness crept in, a quiet phantom that his power and wealth could never fully banish. He was Jack Costello. To most, he was the ghost, a name earned for his ability to move through the city's underbelly without a ripple. His influence felt, but his presence rarely seen. But tonight he just felt like Jack, a man in his late 30s with silver threading his temples, staring out a window at a world that felt impossibly far away. Then, his focus snagged on something. A small point of chaos in the managed chaos of the storm. A woman stood under the flickering halo of a street lamp, her back to him. A large brown paper grocery bag, soaked through and heavy, had just given way. The contents spilled onto the wet, grimy pavement. Oranges rolled like scattered jewels into a dark puddle. A carton of milk burst, its whiteness a stark splash against the black asphalt. She let out a soundless cry of frustration, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It was a common enough sight in this part of the city, a small, everyday tragedy. Normally, Jack would have looked away, his mind already back on shipping routes and profit margins. But he didn't. Something held his gaze. The way her chestnut hair, escaping a hasty knot, clung to her neck in damp curls. The line of her shoulders, tired but not broken. There was a familiarity in her posture, a ghost of a memory that tugged at a deeply buried nerve. He found himself leaning forward, his breath fogging a small patch on the window. She knelt, her movements swift and desperate, trying to salvage what she could. Her hands, chapped from the cold, gathered a runaway apple. She ignored the dirty water soaking the knees of her worn jeans. As she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, she turned just enough for the streetlight to catch her profile. And the world stopped. The hum of the engine vanished. The drumming of the rain went silent. The city, the traffic, the entire world outside his window dissolved into an irrelevant blur. And all that existed was her face. Older, yes, etched with lines of worry and hardship he didn't recognize. But it was her, unmistakably. The gentle curve of her jaw, the shape of her mouth, the slope of her nose. Emma. The name was not a thought, it was a physical impact, a blow to his chest that knocked the air from his lungs. It had been 7 years. 7 years since he had last seen that face. 7 years of a cold, hollow ache that he had learned to live with, to build his empire around, to bury under layers of calculated ruthlessness. He had told himself she was a dream, a chapter from a different life, a man he no longer was. He had convinced himself she was gone, vanished forever, a casualty of the choices he had made. The official story, the one he allowed the world to believe, was that she had left him, that she could not handle the life he was destined for. The truth, the one he held in the darkest corners of his heart, was that he had failed to protect her. He had let his world touch hers, and it had consumed her. His hand, the one not wearing the ring, clenched into a fist on the supple leather of the seat. The seams of his tailored suit felt tight across his shoulders. He could feel the faint pull of the old scar on his jawline, a constant reminder of the violence that defined his existence, the violence that had driven her away. He had searched. In the beginning, he had turned the city upside down. He had used all his resources, all his reach, to find a single trace of her. But she had disappeared as if she had never been. It was a professional disappearing act, and it had nearly broken him. Over time, the desperate search had cooled into a permanent, low-grade fever of regret. Now, here she was, kneeling on a dirty sidewalk in the pouring rain, scrambling for spilled groceries. The sight was a knife twisting in his gut. This was her life, this struggle? While he sat in climate-controlled luxury, she was fighting for a carton of milk. A wave of nauseating self-loathing washed over him. What had he become? A man who could command armies of hardened criminals, but could not keep the one person who mattered safe and happy. Before the full weight of her reappearance could settle, two small figures darted out from the shelter of a nearby doorway. They ran to her side, two little blurs of motion in colorful raincoats. A boy and a girl. Twins, he realized. They couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old. They immediately began to help their mother, their tiny hands picking up a stray carrot, a box of crackers. The girl, her face obscured by a yellow hood, said something that made Emma smile. It was a fragile, weary smile, but it was the same one he remembered. The one that used to be just for him. The sight of it made his chest ache, with a longing so fierce it was almost unbearable. He had forgotten what that smile felt like. The boy in a blue raincoat looked up. His eyes scanned the street, the line of unmoving cars. For a split second, his gaze locked with the dark tinted window of Jack's sedan. The headlights from the car behind Jack's illuminated the child's face, cutting through the gloom. And Jack Costello's carefully constructed world did not just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The boy had Emma's chestnut hair. He had her determined little chin. But his eyes, they were not his mother's warm brown. They were a startling, intense slate gray. They were intelligent, observant, and old for a child's face. They were Jack's eyes. They were the Costello eyes, an unmistakable, irrefutable genetic stamp passed down through generations. He was staring at his own reflection in the face of a child he never knew existed. His son. The word detonated in the silent chamber of his mind. Son, he had a son, and a daughter. Twins. The math was instantaneous, brutal, and perfect. 7 years, they were 6. It all fit. The timeline was a testament to a truth he had never even allowed himself to imagine. When she left, she had been carrying his children. A storm of emotions, more violent than the one raging outside, ripped through him. There was shock, a profound, world-altering disbelief that left him lightheaded. Then came a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, so potent it felt like pain. It was followed instantly by a cold, black rage. A fury directed at the world, at his enemies, at himself. He had been robbed. 7 years of their lives, their first steps, their first words, all the scraped knees and bedtime stories, stolen from him. He had been living as a ghost while his own flesh and blood, his legacy, was out in the world, struggling. He saw Emma wrap an arm around each of them, pulling them close. She was fierce in her protection, a lioness shielding her cubs from the storm, but he could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. She was alone. She had been doing this all alone for 7 years. The thought was a fresh wound. She had carried them, birthed them, and raised them, all while believing he was gone, or worse, that he had abandoned her. The lie that had been told to her, the threat that had made her run, was now a crime of unimaginable proportions. It wasn't just his heart that had been broken. His entire future had been stolen and hidden from him. The car in front of them lurched forward. The gridlock was breaking. His driver, a stoic man named David, shifted the car into gear. They were starting to move. They would drive past her. She would gather her ruined groceries and disappear back into the shadows of the city, taking his children with her. She would be gone again. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in over a decade. He was a man who thrived on control, on calculated risks, and predictable outcomes. This was chaos. This was primal. The fear of losing them again, of letting them slip through his fingers now that he knew they existed, was more terrifying than any bullet or betrayal he had ever faced. He could not let that happen. He would not. His voice, when he finally found it, was a raw, unfamiliar sound in the insulated quiet of the car. It was the voice of a man being ripped apart and put back together all at once. "Stop the car!" David glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable but professional. "Sir, the traffic is moving. We have the green light." "I said stop the car, now!" The command was low, but it held the unyielding weight of his authority. It was the voice that made hardened men flinch. David did not hesitate again. He brought the heavy sedan to an abrupt halt, earning an angry honk from the car behind them. Jack's two security men, sitting in the front passenger seat and in the follow car, were instantly on alert. Their hands moved instinctively to their jackets. They were trained for threats, for ambushes. They were not trained for this. They could not possibly understand that the greatest threat to Jack Costello's world was not a rival crew, but the possibility of a woman and two children walking away. Jack didn't wait for questions. He didn't explain. He reached for the handle, his movements jerky, devoid of his usual fluid grace. The world had narrowed to three figures on a rain-swept sidewalk 50 feet away. His entire being, every fiber of his soul, was screaming one word: mine. He pushed the heavy door open, ignoring the automated system. A blast of cold, wet air filled the car. The sounds of the city rushed in, loud and jarring. The rain hit his face, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He didn't feel it. His expensive suit was already getting soaked. He didn't care. His security detail scrambled. "Mr. Costello! Sir, wait!" one of them shouted, already opening his own door. But Jack was already out, standing on the slick pavement. The city lights reflected in his gray eyes, but he only saw her. She had just managed to get the children back into the relative shelter of the doorway. She was about to turn, to blend back into the anonymity of the city, to vanish. He took a step, then another. His polished Italian leather shoes splashed in a puddle, but he didn't notice. All the years of loss, of regret, of cold emptiness coalesced into a single desperate sound. His voice was rough, torn from his throat, a name he had only dared to whisper in the dead of night. "Emma?" The name hung in the damp air, a ghost cutting through the noise of the city. Emma froze. Every muscle in her body went rigid. That voice, it was deeper now, rougher, weathered by years she could not account for. But it was his. A sound she had buried so deep within herself, she thought she had imagined it into oblivion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She instinctively spun around, her body forming a shield in front of the twins. She shoved Thomas and Sarah behind her, her hands gripping their small shoulders so tightly she could feel their fragile bones. Run. The word was a silent scream in her mind, but her feet were cemented to the wet pavement. Rain plastered strands of chestnut hair to her cheeks. The spilled bag of groceries, the rolling apple, the broken carton of eggs, it all dissolved into an insignificant mess at her feet. None of it mattered. The only thing that existed was the man stepping out of the black, imposing car. His shadow fell over them long before he was close. Two other men in dark suits moved with him, their faces grim, their hands near their jackets. They were trying to flank him, to shield him, speaking in low, urgent tones. But he waved them off with a short, dismissive gesture, his eyes never leaving her. It was Jack, but it was a version of him carved from stone. The boyish charm she remembered was gone, replaced by an unyielding authority that settled on his shoulders like a mantle. The dark hair was still thick, but now shot through with distinguished silver at the temples, and a faint white scar traced a line along his jaw, a detail she had never seen, a story she did not know. His tailored suit shed rain as if it were an annoyance beneath his notice. He was power. He was danger. He was everything she had run from. His gaze was an inferno. It swept over her, taking in her worn coat, her tired face, the desperation that clung to her like a second skin. She felt herself shrink under that look, a decade of hardship laid bare in a single brutal second. Then his eyes dropped to the two small figures huddled behind her legs. Sarah peeked out from behind Emma's coat, her wide, curious eyes staring. Thomas stood half hidden, his small hand clutching his sister's jacket, his face a miniature mask of caution. But his eyes, those impossible gray eyes, were fixed on Jack. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The traffic, the rain, the distant sirens, it all faded into a dull roar. Jack's expression cracked. The cold mask of command shattered, and underneath was a storm of raw, unguarded emotion. Shock, disbelief, a pain so profound it seemed to physically wound him. And then, something else. A fierce, undeniable certainty, a blaze of possession that was terrifying in its intensity. He took another step, his expensive leather shoes splashing in a grimy puddle. "Emma," he said again, his voice cracking on her name. It was not a question this time. It was a statement, an accusation, a prayer. One of his men moved forward. "Sir, this isn't secure. We need to go." Jack didn't even look at him. "Stay in the car, Leo," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. The older man, Leo, hesitated for a second, his sharp eyes darting from Jack to Emma and the children, before giving a curt nod and retreating. Emma found her voice, a ragged, trembling whisper. "Stay away from us." Her hand tightened on Thomas's shoulder. She could feel him trembling. Or maybe that was her own hand shaking. She couldn't tell. Jack ignored her words as if she hadn't spoken. He knelt, slowly, deliberately, bringing himself down to the children's level. The expensive fabric of his trousers soaked up the street water, but he didn't seem to notice. His intense gray eyes, the same shade as her son's, were locked on Thomas. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a gentle greeting. He just looked, his gaze drinking in every detail of the boy's face, then shifting to Sarah, who was now staring openly. He saw it all. The shape of her jaw in Thomas's face, the stubborn tilt of her chin in Sarah's, and the eyes, their eyes, his eyes, the Costello eyes. The truth was a physical blow, visible in the way his shoulders tensed and his breath hitched. He had lost her, but she had kept a part of him. Two parts. The realization was not a gentle dawn. It was a lightning strike that lit up the wasteland of the last 7 years, revealing everything he had lost, everything that had been stolen. He slowly rose to his full height, his gaze returning to Emma. The raw pain was still there, but it was now overlaid with something harder. An iron will, a resolve that left no room for argument. The world he lived in was one of orders, of power, of things being done because he willed them to be. And in that moment, he willed this. "You're all coming with me, Mom," he said. The words were not a request. They were not an offer. They were a command, delivered with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had not been disobeyed in a very long time. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Emma's shock. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "No, we're not. You can't just... You can't." She started to back away, pulling the children with her. The street was no longer a place of hardship. It was her territory, her ground. This man was the invader. Jack took a step for every one she took back. "Emma, don't." His voice held a warning that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Don't make me force you. Not in front of them." Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. "Force me? Who do you think you are? You were gone. They told me you were dead." The words tumbled out, a confession she had never meant to speak. A flicker of confusion, then cold fury crossed Jack's face. "Who told you that?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a growl. But there was no time for answers. Another car horn blared, long and impatient. The city was closing in. Jack's face hardened again, his brief lapse into questioning sealed over by immediate necessity. The street was no place for this. It was exposed. It was dangerous. 1,000 unseen threats could be lurking in the shadows, and his entire world was standing unprotected in the rain. "We will talk about this later," he stated. He glanced at one of his men who had remained by the car door. "Get the bags." Without waiting for a reply, he closed the distance between them. He didn't grab her. His movements were controlled, deliberate. He placed one hand on her back, a firm, undeniable pressure guiding her toward the open door of the car. His other hand gently, almost reverently, rested for a second on Thomas's head. The touch was like an electric shock. Emma flinched, but she was herded forward, propelled by his unyielding presence. It was not violent, but it was absolute. She was a leaf caught in a current, powerless to resist. The twins, sensing the shift in power, the finality in the man's tone, went quiet. They allowed themselves to be steered, their small hands still clutching their mother's coat. The interior of the car was another universe. The moment the heavy door closed, the chaotic symphony of the city was silenced, replaced by a soft, humming quiet. The air was warm and smelled of clean leather, and something else, something subtle and expensive. Soft light glowed from the ceiling. Emma found herself sitting on a plush seat that felt impossibly vast. The children were on either side of her, looking around with wide, bewildered eyes. Sarah reached out a tentative finger and touched the polished wood paneling on the door. Jack slid in opposite them, his presence filling the spacious compartment, making it feel small and claustrophobic. One of his guards got in the front passenger seat, and the driver pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into traffic with an effortless glide. Emma watched the rain-streaked street she had just been standing on slide away. The spilled groceries, the broken life, all of it receding as they were cocooned in this bubble of impossible luxury and menace. She looked at Jack. He had stripped off his wetsuit jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt and a dark gray waistcoat that fit him perfectly. He was watching the children, his expression unreadable. His hands rested on his knees, the ornate gold signet ring on his pinky finger catching the light, the Costello family ring. The wolf's head, a symbol of the world she had fled, the world that had swallowed the boy she loved and spit out this powerful, dangerous man. "What do you want, Jack?" she asked, her voice low and tight, willing it not to shake. He finally tore his gaze from the twins and met her eyes. The fire was still there, but it was banked now, simmering under a layer of control. "What do you think I want?" he countered, his voice quiet. "I just found out you have a son and a daughter. They have been living on the streets while I have been—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the opulent car, at the world outside the window. A wave of self-loathing washed over his face, so raw and potent it startled her. "That ends. Tonight. They're my children," she said, defiance rising in her chest. It was the only weapon she had. "They are our children," he corrected her, his voice soft but edged with steel. "And they will never want for anything ever again. They will be safe." Safe. The word was a bitter irony. She had run to keep them safe. Safe from him, from his world, from the threats that came with the Costello name. And now he was claiming that only he could provide that safety. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat, but she choked it down. Thomas, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. "Mama," he whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "Who is he?" Emma's heart broke. She didn't know how to answer. How could she explain this ghost from the past, this king of a violent kingdom who now sat before them, claiming to be their father? Before she could form a reply, Jack answered for her. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes on Thomas. He didn't try to smile or soften his expression. He simply gave him the truth, or a version of it. "My name is Jack," he said, his voice even. "I am an old friend of your mother's." Sarah, ever the bolder of the two, piped up. "You have eyes like Tommy." A muscle in Jack's jaw twitched. It was the only sign of the impact her innocent observation had on him. "Yes," he said softly. "I do." The rest of the drive was silent. A thick, heavy tension filled the car. Emma held her children close, her mind racing. She was trapped. She had no money, no phone, no one to call. She had been plucked from her life as easily as picking a flower, and now she was being transported to a destination unknown, under the power of a man she no longer knew. A man she had once loved with every fiber of her being. A man she had mourned. A man who was now a stranger with her son's eyes. The car descended into a private, brightly lit underground garage. The silence here was even more profound. The engine cut out, and the driver and the guard, Leo, got out of the car. Leo opened the door for Jack, then came around to her side. Emma didn't move. She felt paralyzed. Jack stood outside, waiting. He didn't rush her. He just stood there, his patience a tangible force. Emma, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Come on. Slowly she moved, helping the children out of the car. They stood in a clean, sterile concrete space. Ahead of them was a single, unmarked metal door. Leo held it open, revealing a private elevator, all brushed steel and soft lighting. They stepped inside, the four of them and Leo, who stood discreetly in the corner. Jack pressed the button, marked with a simple P. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its silent, impossibly smooth ascent. It didn't rumble or shake. It felt like floating. Emma stared at her reflection in the polished steel walls. A tired woman with fear in her eyes, flanked by two small, bewildered children, and behind them the looming figure of a man in a waistcoat and a heavy gold ring. Her captor, her savior, her past and her terrifying, unknown future, all in one. The elevator slowed to a stop with a quiet chime. The doors slid open, not into a hallway, but directly into a living space. And Emma forgot how to breathe. They were standing in the scupping. The apartment, if it could be called that, was a vast expanse of white marble and glass. The entire far wall was made of floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a breathtaking panoramic view of the city at night. The skyline glittered like a spilled chest of jewels, a million lights twinkling in the darkness below. The space was enormous, minimalist, and eerily quiet. A long white sofa sat in the middle of the room, looking small and lost. A piece of abstract art hung on one wall. Everything was sleek, modern, and cold. It was less a home and more a monument to wealth and power. The twins were speechless. Sarah let go of Emma's hand and took a few steps forward, her small shoes silent on the marble floor. She walked toward the immense window, pressing her hands against the cool glass, her face a mask of pure wonder. Wow, she breathed, the sound tiny in the vast silence. Mama, look, it's all the stars. Thomas followed her, more cautiously, but his eyes were just as wide. He stood beside his sister, staring out at the sprawling metropolis. A kingdom of light spread at their feet. For a moment they were just children, captivated by a beautiful sight. Jack watched them, a strange, soft look on his face. It was the look of a starving man finally offered a feast. He had brought them here, to his fortress in the clouds, to the pinnacle of his empire. He wanted to give them the world. But Emma saw something different. She looked past the children, past Jack, at the glittering view. She saw the sheer, terrifying drop on the other side of the glass. She saw the opulence, the sterile perfection, the cold gold fixtures that gleamed on the bathroom door down a long hall. She saw the silence, the isolation. There was only one way in and one way out. This wasn't a home. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. The first thing Emma noticed was the silence. It was a deep, unnatural quiet, the kind that absorbed sound rather than just lacked it. In her small apartment, silence was never truly silent. There was always the hum of the old refrigerator, the groan of pipes in the wall, the distant wail of a siren bleeding through the thin glass. Here, the silence was a weight. It was the sound of money, thick and suffocating. She had slept on a sofa wider than her own bed, covered with a cashmere throw that felt like a cloud against her skin. She had refused the guest suite Jack had offered, a gesture of defiance he had accepted with a tight nod. Her body ached with a fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. It was the exhaustion of a 6-year-long fight for survival, a tension that had become a permanent part of her. Sunlight, clean and sharp, sliced through the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the sterile air. The city sprawled below them, a silent, sprawling map of a life she no longer recognized. She pushed herself up, the soft fabric of the throw pooling around her. Her clothes from yesterday, damp and wrinkled, were folded neatly on a glass coffee table. Someone had taken them, washed them, and returned them while she slept. The thought sent a chill through her. It was an act of care that felt like an invasion. She heard a soft gasp from across the living area. Thomas and Sarah were awake. They stood before a newly opened doorway, a room that had been closed the night before. They were frozen, their small hands clutching each other's, their faces a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Emma walked toward them, her bare feet cold on the polished marble floor. She followed their gaze into the room and her breath caught in her throat. It was a child's fantasy. The room was filled, not just with a few toys, but with an entire store's worth. A miniature kitchen with stainless steel appliances stood in one corner. A bright red electric car was parked next to a mountain of building blocks. Dolls with silken hair and elaborate dresses lined a shelf, and a sprawling train set snaked across a plush rug. Racks of new clothes stood against one wall, vibrant colors and soft fabrics, a stark contrast to the worn jeans and faded t-shirts her children owned. Jack stood near the window, dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark trousers. He looked different without the armor of his suit, younger and somehow more dangerous in his quiet stillness. He wasn't looking at the toys. He was watching his children. His face held a fragile, desperate hope that was more unnerving than any command. Sarah took a hesitant step inside, her hand reaching for a large, fluffy teddy bear, its fur a pristine white. She looked back at Emma, her eyes wide with a question. "Can I?" Emma's heart cracked. How could she deny them this? How could she explain that this explosion of generosity felt like a cage being built around them, bar by gilded bar? "I thought they might like a few things," Jack said, his voice low. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He clasped them behind his back. "I wasn't sure what their interests were." A few things. The words hung in the air, a testament to the chasm between their worlds. This wasn't a few things. This was an erasure. It was a loud, extravagant attempt to paint over the 6 years of struggle, of scraped knees on concrete playgrounds, of secondhand toys with missing pieces, of birthdays celebrated with a single cupcake and a handmade card. "Thank you," Emma said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. She forced a smile for her children. "Go on," she whispered. "It's okay." Sarah let out a little squeal and hugged the bear. Thomas, ever the cautious one, walked slowly toward the train set. He knelt, his small finger tracing the track, his expression unreadable. He had his father's eyes, but he had his mother's caution. He knew on some primal level that things that seemed too good to be true often were. Emma watched Jack watch them. He looked like a starving man watching a feast through a window. There was a profound hunger in his gaze, a desperate need to connect, but he didn't know how. He only knew how to acquire, to provide, to own. He was trying to buy back 6 years of missed first steps, lost teeth, and bedtime stories. And a part of Emma, the part that had scrubbed floors and skipped meals to keep her children fed, hated him for it. Hated him for the ease with which he could do this, and for the fact that it was his absence that made it necessary at all. She backed away from the doorway, her throat tight. She went to the kitchen, a sleek expanse of chrome and black stone. She opened a cabinet, searching for a mug, for something normal and familiar. Everything was perfectly arranged, a silent testament to a life of ordered solitude. She found a plain, white mug, filled it with water from the tap, and drank, her hand shaking slightly. She could feel his presence behind her before he spoke. "They seem happy," Jack said. Emma didn't turn around. She gripped the cold marble of the countertop. "They're children, Jack. A room full of toys will make any child happy for an hour. I want them to be happy for more than an hour, Emma." "Do you?" She finally turned, her voice sharp. "Or do you want to feel better? Is this for them, or is it for you? A down payment on a clear conscience." Hurt flickered in his gray eyes, so quick she almost missed it. "It's for them," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "It's to give them what I should have been giving them all along." "You can't," she shot back. "You can't give them back their childhood. You can't give them back the years they wondered why they didn't have a father like the other kids. You can't just throw money at the hole you left in their lives and expect it to be filled." "You're the one who left," he said, the words quiet but heavy as stones. "You disappeared. No note, no call, just gone. I looked for you. For months I had people searching everywhere." The accusation, the sheer, unblinking injustice of it, broke something inside her. The carefully constructed dam she had built around her heart for 6 years crumbled. Laughter, sharp and broken, escaped her lips. "You looked for me?" she repeated, the sound hysterical. "You looked for me?" The rest of the day passed in a strained truce. Emma insisted on making the children lunch herself, a simple meal of sandwiches and sliced apples that felt like an act of rebellion in the chef-grade kitchen. Jack kept his distance, disappearing into a study she hadn't noticed before. He was giving her space, but it didn't feel like a kindness. It felt like a predator circling, waiting for its prey to tire. Thomas and Sarah played, their quiet excitement a constant, painful reminder of all they had missed. They moved through the vast apartment with a cautious wonder, touching soft rugs and smooth surfaces. They were good kids. They had learned to be quiet, to not take up too much space, to be mindful of their mother's fragile moods. Seeing them here in this place of infinite space made Emma's heart ache with a confusing mix of relief and terror. They were safe for now, but they were in his world, and his world had chewed her up and spit her out once before. She put them to bed that evening in the second guest suite, a room with two beds that looked out over the glittering city. Sarah fell asleep instantly, clutching her new white bear. Thomas stayed awake a little longer. "Is this our new home, Mommy?" he asked. His small voice barely a whisper in the dark. Emma sat on the edge of his bed, stroking his hair. The lie she wanted to tell him, "No, sweetie, this is just for a little while," stuck in her throat, because she didn't know. She had no money, no plan, and nowhere else to go. Jack had her trapped, not with locks and bars, but with comfort and safety, a far more effective prison. "We're just visiting for a little bit," she said, the words feeling hollow. He seemed to accept this, his body finally relaxing into the soft mattress. "Is that man our dad?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had been dreading it, preparing for it, but it still stole her breath. "Yes, Thomas, he is. He has my eyes," Thomas said, a simple statement of fact. Then his own gray eyes, so like his father's, drifted shut. Emma stayed there for a long time, watching them sleep. Their peaceful faces were a testament to everything she had fought for. She had protected them. She had kept them safe from the world that had tried to erase them before they were even born. But she had brought them right back to the heart of it. Her anger, simmering all day, finally boiled over. It was a cold, clear rage. She stood up, her movements stiff, and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The main living area was dark, save for the millions of distant city lights that turned the windows into living art. Jack was standing there, a silhouette against the skyline, a glass of something dark in his hand. He turned as she approached, his face unreadable in the dim light. "They're asleep," she said, her voice flat. "Good," he replied. They had a long day. "We need to talk." He gestured to one of the white leather sofas. "Sit." It wasn't a request. She ignored it, remaining on her feet. She needed to feel the ground under her, to feel solid. "You can't keep us here, Jack." "I'm not keeping you anywhere," he said calmly. "I'm protecting you. There's a difference, Bohemian. It doesn't feel different. It feels like I've traded one kind of prison for another. A much more comfortable one, I'll grant you that, but it's a care of all the same best." "What do you want, Emma?" he asked, his voice laced with a frustration he was trying to contain. "Do you want to go back to that? To dropping your groceries in the rain? To worrying about whether you can afford to fix your children's shoes? Because I won't allow that. They are my children, too." "You don't get to say that," she snapped, her control finally shattering. "You don't get to swoop in after 6 years and claim them like a long-lost possession you just remembered you owned. Where were you, Jack? Where were you when Thomas had a fever so high I was terrified he would stop breathing? Where were you when Sarah cried for a week because I couldn't afford the cheap plastic doll all the other girls in her class had? Where were you when I was so tired and so alone I thought I was going to break into a million pieces?" His face tightened, the muscles in his jaw working. "I was looking for you," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Every day for a year I had men turning this city upside down. And then I kept looking. But you vanished. You left me, Emma. You ran without a word." The laughter bubbled up again, raw and painful. "Left you? I left you?" She took a step closer, her body trembling with a rage that was 6 years old. "You think I wanted to leave? You think I wanted to raise our children alone, scared and with nothing? I loved you, you idiot." The words, the simple, agonizing truth hung between them. His composure finally broke. The glass in his hand trembled. Then why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why would you go? Tears streamed down her face now, hot and angry, because you were dead. The silence that followed was absolute. The city noise outside, the hum of the building, everything ceased to exist. Jack just stared at her, his gray eyes wide with a confusion so profound it looked like pain. What did you say? He whispered. I said you were dead, she repeated, her voice shaking with sobs she could no longer hold back. That's why I left. Because the man who came to my door told me you were dead. She sank onto the sofa then, her legs giving out. The whole story came pouring out of her, a torrent of memory and fear she had kept locked away. It was a Tuesday, she began, her voice thick. I remember because I just bought groceries. I was so happy. I'd found a heartbeat at the clinic that morning. One tiny fluttering heartbeat. I was going to tell you that night. I bought your favorite pasta. I was going to make dinner, and I was going to tell you we were going to be a family. Jack sat down heavily in the armchair opposite her, his face ashen. He didn't speak. He just listened, his entire being focused on her. There was a knock on the door, she continued, staring at her hands, twisting them in her lap. It wasn't you, it was a man. I'd seen him with you before at one of your clubs. He was always quiet, always watching. He had a nice suit, a polite smile. She looked up at Jack, her eyes pleading with him to understand. He was so calm, Jack. That's what made it so terrifying. He told me there had been an incident, a deal that went bad. He said you were gone, that you wouldn't be coming home. Ever. The memory was so vivid she could feel the cold dread creeping up her spine all over again. I didn't believe him. I told him he was lying. I tried to slam the door, but he stopped it with his foot, and his smile, it just disappeared. He looked at me, and then he looked down at my stomach. I wasn't even showing yet, but he knew, or maybe he just guessed. Her voice dropped to a choked whisper. He said he was a friend. He said he was there to help me. He told me that your enemies were now cleaning house, tying up loose ends, and that a woman carrying Jack Costello's child was the loosest end of all. He gave me a bag full of cash. He said to take it and run. Disappear. He said if I ever came back, if anyone ever found out about the baby, they would find us. And they wouldn't be so polite the next time. She was openly weeping now, the pain of that night as fresh as if it were yesterday. So I ran, Jack. I ran because I thought you were dead. I ran to save our baby. I spent every cent of that money disappearing, changing my name, moving from one town to the next until I was sure no one was looking anymore. I grieved you. I mourned you alone in a tiny rented room while I was sick every morning. I gave birth to our children alone. I did it all because I was trying to protect the only part of you I had left. Jack was completely still, carved from stone. The only movement was the slow clenching and unclenching of his fist on the arm of the chair. The regret on his face was a terrible thing to see. It was the face of a man who had built his entire world on a foundation of lies and had only just realized it. The story he had told himself for 6 years, the story of the woman who couldn't handle his life and abandoned him, had just been burned to the ground. He finally moved, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual command. It was the voice of a man hollowed out. Who, Emma? He asked, the question barely audible. Tell me his name. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She could see the man's face as clearly as she could see Jack's. The polite smile, the cold eyes, the face that had haunted her nightmares for years. I don't remember his last name, she stammered, her mind racing back. He was always just Dominic. He had a scar, a small one, right here. She touched her own eyebrow. Jack's eyes closed for a second. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him. When he opened his eyes again, the grief was gone. In its place was something cold and absolute. It was a stillness more terrifying than any rage she had ever witnessed. It was the quiet focus of a hunter who has just caught the scent of his lifelong prey. Dominic Falcone, he said. The name was not a question. It was a judgment. Emma nodded, trembling. Yes, that was it, Falcone. She watched as a change came over him. the man who had been clumsily trying to be a father, the man who had looked lost and hurt, vanished. In his place sat Jack Costello, the ghost, a man who had earned his name because those who crossed him simply ceased to exist. He knew the name, he knew the man, and in that single horrifying moment of recognition on Jack's face, Emma understood. The threat wasn't over. It had just been sleeping, and she had just woken it up. The name hung in the air between them, swollen, sharp, and impossibly heavy. It settled in the opulent silence of the penthouse. A poison dropped into a glass of clean water. Emma's face was pale, her eyes wide with the remembered terror of that long-ago threat. She had finally given voice to the ghost that had haunted her for 7 years. And in doing so, she had pointed a finger at a man Jack Costello had trusted, a man who had eaten at his table, a man who was one of his own. For a long moment, Jack did not move. He did not breathe. The world seemed to narrow to the space between him and Emma, the city lights blurring into meaningless streaks of color beyond the glass. The hurt he felt was a physical thing, a white-hot spike driving into his chest. But then, something else rose to meet it. It was cold and terrifyingly calm. A layer of ice formed over the molten core of his grief. The pain was still there, but it was no longer just pain. It was fuel. His jaw tightened, the faint scar there turning white. He gave Emma a single brief nod. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was an acknowledgement of a debt that was about to be collected with interest. Without another word to her, he turned and walked to the polished obsidian desk that dominated one side of the living area. His movements were fluid and precise, devoid of any wasted energy. He was no longer the man stunned by a ghost from his past. He was the man they called the Ghost, a name earned through ruthless efficiency. He picked up the secure phone, its weight familiar in his hand. He pressed a single button. It rang only once before a calm, measured voice answered. Yes? Leo, my office. Now, Jack said. His tone was flat, leaving no room for questions or delay. He ended the call and placed the phone back in its cradle with a quiet click that echoed in the vast room. Emma was still standing where he'd left her, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her pieces together. Her eyes followed him, filled with a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a memory, but the fear of what she had just unleashed. She had seen the shift in him, the closing of a door behind his eyes, locking away the vulnerable man and leaving something much harder in his place. Jack, what are you going to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, and for a second, the ice in his gaze cracked. He saw the mother of his children, the woman he had mourned for years, standing in his cold, empty home. He had brought her here to protect her, but he had only dragged her back into the very world that had torn them apart. I'm going to fix it, he said, his voice low and raw. I'm going to burn away the rot. You and the children will be safe. I promise you that. He wanted to say more. He wanted to cross the room and hold her, to absorb her fear into himself. But the cold rage was a wall between them. To touch her now felt like a lie. His hands were meant for something else tonight. He looked toward the hallway where Thomas and Sarah were sleeping, their chests rising and falling in the peaceful ignorance of childhood. They had his eyes. They had his blood. And someone had tried to erase them before they were even born. The thought was a fresh wave of ice water in his veins. He turned his back on Emma and stared out at the sprawling city below. It looked like a circuit board, a network of power and light that he had learned to master. He had spent years building this empire, securing it, fortifying it against his rivals. He had believed his walls were high enough, his vision clear enough. He had been a fool. His enemy had not stormed the gates. They had simply walked through an open door, spoken a few words, and stolen his entire world while he was looking the other way. The elevator chimed softly, announcing an arrival directly into the penthouse foyer. A few moments later, Leo Romano entered the living room. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, his sharp eyes magnified by thin-frame glasses. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of unshakable competence. Leo was Jack's consigliere, his strategist, his memory. He had served Jack's father before him. More than anyone, Leo understood the architecture of their world. He took in the scene with a quick, discerning glance. He saw Emma, her posture defensive and frightened. He saw the tension in Jack's shoulders as he stood silhouetted against the window. Leo's expression remained neutral, but he knew. This was not business. This was something deeper. Jack, he said, his voice a quiet rumble. Jack turned slowly. Leo, thank you for coming. He gestured to one of the stark white leather armchairs. Sit. Leo sat, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. He waited. He was a patient man, accustomed to Jack's silences. Jack remained standing. He looked from Leo to Emma, then back to Leo. 7 years ago, he began, the words tight. Emma disappeared. I was told she left, that she didn't want this life. Leo nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. I remember we searched, there was no trace. She didn't leave, Jack said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. She was sent away. She was threatened, told that I was gone, and that she and our unborn child would be next. A flicker of shock finally broke through Leo's composure. His gaze shifted to Emma, then back to Jack, a new understanding dawning. The children. He had seen them briefly when they arrived. He had noted the resemblance, the impossible gray eyes, but had filed it away as a matter for another time. Now the pieces slammed into place. Who? Leo asked, his voice now as hard as Jack's. Jack gave him the name Emma had spoken. A captain, a man named Santino, a man who had been with the organization for 15 years, known for his ambition but presumed to be loyal. Leo's face became a stony mask. A captain turning on the family was a cardinal sin. But threatening the woman of the boss, a woman carrying his heir, was an act of war on a spiritual level. It was unthinkable. Santino, Leo repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Are you certain? Emma is certain, Jack countered, his word final. He walked over to the bar and poured a glass of water, his hand steady. He needed the simple, physical task to anchor him. I don't want him touched. Not yet. I want to know who he was working for. I want to know who gave the order. I want to know everything. I want his life, from the day he was born until this moment, mapped out. Every call, every bank transfer, every meeting he ever took that was even slightly off book. I want to know who he breathes for. Leo listened, his focus absolute. It will take time to unravel something that old. You have 24 hours, Jacqueline said, turning to face him. His eyes were devoid of any warmth. Use whatever resources you need. Pull men from whatever jobs they're on. I want the ghost behind this, and I want him found by this time tomorrow. Leo stood, picking up his briefcase. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head. It will be done. He glanced once more at Emma, a look of profound, almost sorrowful respect in his eyes, before he turned and walked back to the elevator. The doors slid shut, and he was gone. The silence that returned was different. It was charged, humming with the energy of a machine that had just been switched on. Emma finally moved, walking slowly toward the couch and sinking into it. She looked small against the enormous white cushions. You believe me, she said. It wasn't a question. Jack came and stood before her. The rage was still there, a coal fire behind his ribs, but his focus was on her now. I never should have doubted you left in the first place, Victor, he said, the admission costing him more than any business deal ever had. I was arrogant. I thought my world was secure. I never imagined someone would be so bold, or that I could be so blind. He finally sat down, not next to her, but in the armchair Leo had vacated, keeping a formal distance. He needed the space. He felt too volatile, too dangerous to be near her, near anyone. He told me you were dead, Emma whispered, her gaze distant as she relived the memory. He showed me an article, a car bombing. It looked real. He said your enemies were cleaning house and that anyone connected to you was a target. He said he was doing me a favor, giving me a chance to disappear, to save my baby. Jack's hands clenched into fists on the arms of the chair. A fake article, a staged warning. It wasn't a simple act of thuggery. It was a calculated, psychological attack. It was precise, surgical, the kind of move designed not just to hurt him, but to cripple him from the inside out. He had spent months after she left in a haze of grief and betrayal, his judgment clouded, his focus shattered. He had made mistakes in that time, lost ground. He saw it now with sickening clarity. Her removal had been strategic. Marcus Thorne, Jack said, the name leaving his lips before he even consciously thought it. Emma looked at him, confused. Who? My rival, Jack explained, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been invisible for years. 7 years ago, Thorne was making a major push to take over the port operations. It was a brutal fight. I was distracted, unfocused. I lost 2 key shipping contracts during that period. I always blamed it on my own state of mind after you were gone. He stood up and began to pace, the pieces of the puzzle assembling themselves in his mind. The car bombing story. Thorne's people had used a similar tactic to spread disinformation just a few months prior to that. The precision of the threat. It had Thorne's signature all over it. He preferred a scalpel to a sledgehammer. He attacked foundations, not walls. And what was a more vital foundation than family? Jack realized with a jolt that he hadn't just lost the woman he loved. He had been disarmed by his greatest enemy, who had identified his heart as his weakest point and expertly cut it out. Emma hadn't run from him. She had been stolen. His children, his son and his daughter, had been stolen from him before he ever knew they existed. The cold fury inside him solidified into something new. It was no longer a wild, emotional fire. It was a diamond-hard point of strategic certainty. The grief for his lost years was still there, an aching void. But now it had a target. The next 24 hours were the longest of Jack's life. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. He confined himself to his office, a room of dark wood and smoked glass adjacent to the main living area. He left Emma and the children to the quiet care of his household staff, a small, fiercely loyal team who asked no questions. He instructed them to give Emma anything she wanted, to make the children comfortable, to create a bubble of peace in the heart of the storm he was about to unleash. Occasionally, he would step out and just watch them. He saw Emma sitting on the thick rug with Thomas and Sarah, a picture book open in her lap. He saw Sarah laugh, a bright, beautiful sound that felt alien in the silent penthouse. He saw Thomas lean his head against his mother's shoulder, his small face serious as he pointed at a drawing of a star. In these moments, the rage and the grief warred within him. He saw the life he should have had. The 7 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and quiet mornings he could never get back. Each stolen memory was another log on the fire of his cold resolve. Emma felt his eyes on her. She would look up and see him standing in the doorway, a dark, brooding figure. His presence was a constant, heavy pressure. She was trapped in this beautiful cage, a spectator to a war she had started just by speaking a name. She feared the man he was becoming, but a deeper part of her, a part she had tried to kill for 7 years, understood that this terrifying man was the only one who could protect her children from the world he inhabited. Late the next afternoon, the elevator chimed again. Leo stepped out, his face grim. He carried the same leather briefcase, but it seemed heavier today. He walked directly to Jack's office, where Jack was waiting, standing by the window. "Talk to me, Leo," Jack said without turning. Leo opened his briefcase on the large mahogany desk. He didn't pull out a single file. He pulled out 3. He laid them side by side. "Santino's finances were a mess 7 years ago," Leo began, his voice crisp and professional. "He had significant gambling debts. 2 weeks after Emma Hayes disappeared, a holding company based in the Caymans made a one-time deposit of $250,000 into an account belonging to his wife's sister. It was untraceable then, but we have better tools now. The holding company, after 6 layers of shell corporations, leads back to Marcus Thorne's primary financial controller." Jack closed his eyes. There it was, the proof, the motive, a desperate man bought and paid for. "The news article Emma was shown," Leo continued, tapping the second file. "It was a fabrication, a clever one. We found a digital ghost of it on a retired server belonging to a graphic designer who did occasional work for one of Thorne's front businesses. He claims he was paid in cash to create a fictional news layout as a prop. He had no idea what it was for." Jack turned from the window, his face a mask of stone. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just lied to her. They had crafted evidence to make the law unbreakable. "So Thorne orchestrated it," Jack stated. "It was not a question. He found my one vulnerability, a vulnerability I didn't even know I had, and he used a traitor in my own house to exploit it." "It appears so," Leo confirmed. His expression was somber. Betrayal on this level poisoned everything. It cast a shadow of doubt over every man, every promise, every loyalty. Santino was the weapon. Thorne was the man aiming it. A terrible quiet filled the office. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade away. For 7 years, Jack had carried the wound of Emma leaving him. He had believed it was a failing in himself, in his life, in their love. He had thought her fear of his world was stronger than her love for him. The truth was so much worse. Their love hadn't failed. It had been murdered. It had been targeted and executed as part of a business strategy. "Where is Santino now?" Jack asked, his voice dangerously soft. Leo hesitated for the first time. He looked down at the third file, his hand resting on it. "That is the most pressing issue. The threat was not 7 years ago, Jack. It never ended." He pushed the final folder across the polished surface of the desk. Jack looked at it, then at Leo's grim face. His heart, which he thought had turned to stone, gave a painful thud. He reached out and opened the folder. Inside were not old documents or bank statements. They were photographs. High-resolution surveillance photos, clear and sharp. The first one showed a restaurant patio, sun-drenched and cheerful. At a small table sat 2 men laughing over a glass of wine. One was Santino, older now, heavier, his face flushed with confidence. The other was Marcus Thorne. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the bottom corner of the photograph. There was a date and timestamp printed in small digital numbers. The picture had been taken just 3 days ago, before he had found Emma on that rain-slicked street, before he knew his children existed. His enemies were meeting, smiling, sharing a drink. Leo placed a finger on the photo. "This meeting took place the day before you found Emma. We don't know what they were discussing, but we have to assume Thorne knows, or that he will know soon. Santino would see the return of Emma and the children not as a miracle, but as the exposure of his deepest treason. He will run to Thorne. He will tell him everything." Jack stared at the photograph. He saw the smug look on Santino's face, the predatory smile on Thorne's. These were the men who had stolen his life. They had stolen his son's first steps, his daughter's first words. And now they were a direct and immediate threat to their future. The problem wasn't a historical betrayal, it was an active conspiracy. The enemy wasn't a ghost from the past. He was here now, and he was already moving. The photographs lay spread across the polished mahogany of his desk. They were a silent, damning testament to betrayal. Marcus Thorne's smug smile was visible in one. A hand clapped on the shoulder of a man Jack had trusted for over a decade. The city glittered coldly outside the panoramic window, a million tiny lights that offered no warmth. For 2 days, Jack had barely slept. He moved through the penthouse like a phantom, fueled by black coffee and a rage so pure it felt like ice in his veins. Leo Romano came and went, his face a mask of grim efficiency, bringing updates and tactical analyses. They spoke in low, clipped tones about supply lines, informants, and vulnerabilities. It was the language Jack knew best, the language of dismantling a man piece by piece. He was so consumed by the mechanics of revenge that he almost missed the change happening in his own home. It was a subtle shift, like the turning of a season. The vast, empty spaces of the penthouse had been punctuated by the sounds of his own measured footsteps and the whisper of the ventilation system. Now there were other sounds. The patter of small feet on the marble floors, a child's sudden laugh echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged rooms, and Emma's voice soft but constant, a thread of warmth weaving through the cold, modern architecture. One morning after a long night spent tracing the trader's financial records, Jack walked out of his study. The sun was streaming through the eastern windows, casting a perfect golden rectangle on the pale gray rug of the main living area. And there, in that patch of light, sat Emma. She was on the floor, her back against the sofa, with Thomas and Sarah curled up on either side of her. She held a brightly colored children's book, her voice a gentle murmur as she read about a bear who had lost his favorite hat. Sarah giggled at one of the pictures, pointing a small finger. Thomas was quieter, his head resting against Emma's arm, his gray eyes, Jack's eyes, fixed on the page with intense concentration. Jack stopped in the shadows of the hallway, a ghost in his own house. He watched them, a silent observer of a life he was never meant to have. The scene was so simple, so painfully normal. It was a universe away from the cold calculations and violent strategies occupying his mind. He was fighting to protect this exact moment, this pocket of sunlight and gentle laughter. Yet he felt completely separate from it. He was the guardian at the gate, the wolf circling the campfire, but he was not allowed inside its warmth. The thought came, sharp and unwelcome, that he was building a fortress around a family that wasn't truly his to claim. He was their protector, their warden, but he was not their father. Not yet. He turned and retreated back into the shadows of his study before they could see him. Later that afternoon, the quiet was broken by a sudden cry. Jack looked up from a city map spread on his table. He heard Emma's quick footsteps, her voice instantly soothing. He walked to the doorway of the living area, his heart giving a strange, unfamiliar lurch. Sarah was on the floor, tears streaming down her face, clutching her knee. She had been chasing Thomas around a large, abstract sculpture and had slipped. A small, angry red scrape was already welling up on her skin. Emma knelt beside her in an instant. She brushed the hair from Sarah's face, her expression one of pure, undiluted tenderness. "Oh, my sweet girl, let me see," she murmured. Her voice the softest thing Jack had ever heard. She gently examined the scrape. "It's just a little battle wound. You're so brave." She leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to the sore spot. "There, all better?" Sarah's sobs subsided into sniffles. She nodded, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. Thomas stood nearby, his face a mask of concern, watching them both. Emma hugged Sarah close, rocking her gently. She looked up and her eyes met Jack's across the room. For a second, her face was unguarded. He saw the flicker of old fear, the defensiveness that had become her armor. But he also saw something else. A weariness, a silent plea that he couldn't decipher. He felt rooted to the spot. His hands, which could sign orders that would crumble empires, felt clumsy and useless. He didn't know the first thing about scraped knees or gentle words. He was an expert in causing pain, not healing it. The chasm between his world and theirs had never felt so vast. Emma held his gaze for a moment longer before turning her attention back to Sarah, her movements all grace and practiced love. Jack felt a profound and hollow ache spread through his chest. He had missed 6 years of this. 6 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and quiet cuddles. Marcus Thorne hadn't just taken Emma. He had stolen a lifetime. That night, the silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. The twins were asleep in their new room, a space that was slowly filling with toys and drawings, small signs of life taking root in the sterile environment. Jack found himself pacing the length of the penthouse, the city lights a blur below. He couldn't shake the image of Emma comforting Sarah. It was a wound in his memory, a reminder of everything he was not. He walked past the living area and saw her. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. Her arms were wrapped around herself, a defensive posture he was beginning to know well. But her hands were not empty. In her palm, catching the faint glow of the city, was a small silver object. He recognized it instantly. A simple heart-shaped locket, tarnished by time. He had given it to her one summer evening, long before the shadows of his life had grown long enough to engulf them both. He'd won it for her at a cheap carnival game, and she had laughed, her eyes brighter than all the flashing lights of the Midway. Inside, he knew, was a tiny faded photograph of the two of them, young and impossibly happy. Seeing it in her hand now, after all these years, after everything that had happened, was like a physical blow. She had kept it. Through all the fear and hardship, through the lonely years of raising their children by herself, she had kept this small piece of him. He moved toward her, his footsteps making no sound on the thick rug. He didn't have a plan. He had no strategy for this. All the words he had rehearsed, all the commands and assurances felt hollow and wrong. He stopped a few feet behind her. She didn't turn, but he saw her shoulders tense. She knew he was there. He could smell the faint scent of her shampoo, a simple, clean fragrance that cut through the sterile air of the room. He stepped beside her, his gaze falling from her tired profile to the locket resting in her palm. Her knuckles were white where she gripped it. For a long moment they stood in silence. Two statues carved from regret and unspoken history. the city breathing beneath them. The man who moved armies with a single phone call felt a tremor of uncertainty. He thought of her reading in the sunbeam. He thought of the gentle way she kissed Sarah's knee. He thought of the 6 years of moments just like those, stolen from him, stolen from them. Reaching out, he slowly, carefully covered her hand with his. His fingers were warm against her cold skin. It was not a gesture of possession. It was not a command. It was a question, a quiet, desperate plea for connection across an ocean of pain. His touch was light, his thumb resting gently over the tarnished, tarm silver of the locket, feeling the faint warmth of her skin beneath it. Emma didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Her hand remained in his, a fragile truce in the dead of night. He felt the tension in her fingers lessen, just slightly. A small breath escaped her lips, a sound of surrender or exhaustion. He couldn't tell which. She finally turned her head, her warm brown eyes meeting his. They were filled with 1,000 things at once. The deep, familiar fear was still there, a shadow in their depths. But beneath it, he saw a profound and heartbreaking longing. He saw the woman he had loved, looking at him as if he were a ghost she was terrified to believe in. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was a raw whisper, fragile and laced with the terror that had been her constant companion. "What happens to them, Jack? What happens to us when he finds out they're here?" Emma's question hung in the air between them, more fragile than the thin silver chain of the locket in her hand. "What happens to us?" The words were a whisper, but they landed in the quiet of the penthouse with the force of a physical blow. Jack watched her, his thumb still resting on the back of her hand, a small point of contact that felt impossibly vast. He had no easy answers. For years, his life had been a series of calculated risks and clean, brutal solutions. But this, the delicate architecture of a family he never knew he had, was a problem with no simple formula. He could not eliminate a feeling. He could not command trust into existence. His gaze drifted past her to the city lights, a glittering, indifferent tapestry spread below them. He had looked at that view 1,000 times and seen only territory, assets, and threats. Now he saw a million windows, a million unknown dangers that could reach for her, for them. His answer, when it came, was not a promise of safety. It was a confession of his own long-held fear. He said, "He doesn't get to win. Not again." His voice was low, rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. It was not the voice of Jack Costello, the ghost. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything once and would burn the world down before he lost it again. Emma's fingers curled slightly around his. She didn't pull away. In his eyes, she saw not the cold commander, but a reflection of her own desperate longing. A longing for this to be real, for the warmth in his touch to be more than a temporary ceasefire in a war she was tired of fighting. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for a fleeting moment, a sliver of impossible hope pushed through it. Maybe, just maybe, this gilded cage could become a fortress. The next morning, the city was washed clean by the night's rain. Sunlight, pale and sharp, cut across the polished floors of the penthouse. It felt different, lighter. A fragile peace had settled in the quiet hours of the night. Emma found herself humming softly in the kitchen, making pancakes for the twins. The simple domestic act felt like a rebellion. She was claiming a piece of this sterile space for herself, for them. Thomas and Sarah were in the living room, their quiet chatter a melody that filled the unnerving silence of the apartment. Sarah was negotiating with her brother over who got to use the blue building blocks, her voice earnest and high. Jack had left early, a brief, "I have to take care of something," his expression unreadable but for the tightness around his jaw. Emma had learned not to ask. She had learned to live in the spaces between his words. But today, the not knowing felt less like a threat and more like a necessary burden. He was fighting a war on a front she couldn't see, and her role was here, to create a bubble of normal, however thin. "Mom, can Barnaby have a pancake too?" Sarah called, running into the kitchen. Barnaby was a scruffy, one-eyed teddy bear, a veteran of 6 years of constant companionship. Emma smiled, flipping a perfectly golden pancake onto a plate. "Of course he can, but he has to share with you." "He's in my bed," Sarah announced, before running back to her construction project. Later, after breakfast, with the twins engrossed in a cartoon, Emma walked through the apartment, collecting stray socks and toys. The sunlight was stronger now, warming the cool leather of the sofas. She felt a strange sense of calm. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the main balcony, intending to slide one open, to let in the crisp morning air and the distant sound of the city waking up. Her hand was on the cool metal handle when she saw it. It was just a small brown shape, perched on the main concrete ledge of the balcony, outside, 20 stories above the ground. Her mind took a second to process the image. It was out of place. Wrong. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart gave a single painful thud against her ribs. She leaned closer, her forehead touching the cold glass. Her blood turned to ice. It was Barnaby, Sarah's scruffy, one-eyed teddy bear. Its single button eye seemed to stare back at her, blank and accusatory. The world tilted. He was supposed to be in Sarah's bed. Emma had tucked Sarah in last night, had pulled the covers up over the little girl and the bear nestled beside her. He was there, inside, safe. The implication crashed over her with the force of a physical wave. It knocked the air from her lungs. Someone had been here, not just in the building, not just on the floor. They had been inside the penthouse. They had walked through the living room, down the hall, and into her daughter's bedroom. They had stood over her sleeping child. They had reached down and taken the bear from her arms. And then they had walked out onto this balcony and placed it on the ledge as a message, a quiet, terrifying declaration. I can get to you. I can get to them whenever I want. A low, strangled sound escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The illusion of the fortress, the fragile hope she had dared to feel, shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a cage. It wasn't a fortress. It was a bullseye, the biggest, most visible target in the entire city. And she had led her children right into the center of it. The sounds of the cartoon from the living room, the bright colors on the screen, suddenly felt obscene. A grotesque parody of the safety she had tried to build. Her legs felt weak, her vision tunneled. The memory of another man, another threat, rose up from the depths of her past, choking her. The smooth, cold voice telling her Jack was gone, telling her what would happen to her and her unborn baby if she stayed. It wasn't a memory, it was a prophecy, and it was coming true. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was an old familiar friend, the same panic that had sent her fleeing into the night 6 years ago. It was a physical thing, a jolt of pure adrenaline that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. Run, hide, disappear. It was the only language she knew for survival. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked toward the master bedroom. Her mind was a frantic storm of logistics. The small canvas bag she had arrived with was still in the closet. It was all she needed. She didn't care about the new clothes, the purpose, the luxury that surrounded her. It was all part of the trap. She pulled the bag out, its rough fabric a familiar comfort in her trembling hands. She threw it on the bed and began pulling clothes from the drawers. Not the new expensive things Jack had bought, her old worn jeans, a faded sweater. The clothes of a person who knew how to be invisible. Her hands shook so badly she could barely fold a t-shirt. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Where would they go? It didn't matter. Anywhere but here. A bus station, a train. She had a little cash hidden in her wallet, enough to get them a few hundred miles away. Enough to buy them a day, maybe 2. After that, she couldn't think about after that. She just had to get them out. Now, before he came back, before the monster who left the bear on the ledge decided to leave something else. Mom, what are you doing? Emma froze, a pair of Sarah's tiny socks clutched in her fist. Thomas was standing in the doorway, his small face etched with confusion. His gray eyes, Jack's eyes, stared at her, wide and questioning. Behind him, Sarah peeked around the doorframe. Emma tried to smile, but her face felt like stone. We're going on a little trip, sweetie. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. A trip? Where? Sarah asked, her own smile starting to form. Are we going to the park? Something like that, Emma managed, her voice thin and reedy. She shoved the socks into the bag. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. a frantic drumbeat of terror. Get out! Get out now! She zipped the bag, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. She grabbed her purse and the children's jackets. Come on, put these on. We have to go. Her urgency, her barely concealed panic, finally registered on their faces. Sarah's smile faded. Thomas's expression grew wary. Is Dad coming? He asked quietly. The question stopped her. Dad. The word was still so new, so fragile, and she was about to snatch it away from them all over again. A wave of guilt washed over her, so strong it almost buckled her knees. But the fear was stronger. The image of that bear on the ledge was burned into her mind. She could protect them from a broken heart. She could not protect them from a bullet. He'll meet us later, she lied again, her voice cracking. Let's go. We have to hurry. She herded them toward the front door, her hands on their small shoulders, her own body a shield. Her hand was on the heavy brass doorknob when it turned from the other side. The door swung open and Jack stood there. He took in the scene in an instant. Emma, pale and terrified, her hand on the door. The children, looking scared and confused, wearing their jackets. The hastily packed bag on the floor at Emma's feet. His eyes, which had been hard and distant when he left, narrowed. They moved from the bag to the children, to Emma's face. He saw the raw primal fear in her eyes. The same fear he had seen on the rain-slicked street, the fear of a hunted animal. Emma, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. What is this? She flinched, pulling the children closer to her. We have to go, Jack. We can't stay here. Go where? His gaze was intense, pinning her in place. He stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind him. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, hot and angry. Don't you understand? He was here. Marcus. He was in the apartment. He was in their room while they were sleeping. Jack's face remained a mask of control, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. What are you talking about? The bear, she cried, her voice breaking. Sarah's bear. Go look. It's on the balcony. On the ledge. Without another word, Jack turned and strode toward the living room. Emma watched him go, her body trembling. She felt Thomas's small hand slip into hers, his fingers gripping hers tightly. Jack stopped in front of the glass doors. He stood there for a long moment, his back to them, perfectly still. Emma could see his reflection in the glass, a dark, imposing silhouette against the bright morning sky. She saw him look down at the spot on the ledge. She saw his shoulders tense, a barely perceptible tightening that spoke of a fury so profound it had no sound. When he turned back, his face was terrifying. The controlled mask was gone. In its place was a cold, lethal rage that made the air in the room feel thin and sharp. His gray eyes were the color of a winter storm. They were the eyes of the ghost the man whispered about in the city's dark corners. And all of that contained violence was now focused on a single point, the threat to his children. He walked back to her, his steps measured and silent. He didn't look at the bag on the floor. He didn't look at the children. He looked only at her. And so you run, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of bitter fact. That's your answer, to take my children and run from me again. The accusation stung, cutting through her fear with a flash of anger. Your children? She shot back, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and indignation. They were my children when I was sleeping in shelters, Jack. They were my children when I was working 2 jobs to keep them fed. Where were you then? This is your world, your fight, your monster. He came here because of you, and he will come for them because of you. Every word was a blow, and he took them without flinching, because they were true. Yes, he said, his voice a low growl. He is my monster, and I will deal with him. But you will not run. Not this time. I have to, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face now. It's the only way to keep them safe. Don't you see that? No, he said, and he closed the distance between them. He reached out and grasped her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, unyielding, but it wasn't rough. It was an anchor in the storm of her panic. He forced her to meet his gaze. You don't see. Running is what he wants. He threatened you once, and you disappeared. He thinks he can do it again. He thinks he can push a button and make you vanish, taking my children with you. He wants to isolate me, to break me. and you are about to give him exactly what he wants." His words hit her with a terrible logic. She had been so consumed by the instinct to flee, she hadn't considered the strategy behind the threat. She had only seen the danger, not the purpose. "Staying here is suicide," she whispered, her resolve crumbling. "No," Jack said, his eyes blazing with a protective fire she had never seen before. "Staying here is the only way to live, because I am here, and he will have to come through me. Do you understand, Emma? He will have to get through me to get to them, and that will not happen." He pulled her forward, his hands still on her shoulders. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, feel the rigid control in his body. He was a coiled spring of lethal intent. "I lost you once because I was blind," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intensely personal. "Because I didn't see the snakes in my own garden. I will not make that mistake again. There is nowhere on this earth you can run where he won't look for you. The only safe place for you and for them is right behind me." He was not commanding her. He was pleading with her. He was asking for the one thing she had sworn never to give him again, her trust. To trust that his power, the very thing that had brought this darkness to their door, was also their only salvation. Her trembling slowly subsided under the force of his conviction. She looked into his eyes and saw the promise there. Stark and absolute. It was terrifying. But it was also the first solid thing she had been able to hold on to all morning. Slowly, shakily, she nodded. A breath he didn't even know he was holding escaped him. The iron tension in his shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. He gently released her, then bent down. He picked up the canvas bag from the floor and walked it back into the bedroom, placing it back in the closet as if it were a piece of forgotten luggage from a trip that had been canceled. When he returned, the children were still huddled by the door, watching him with uncertain eyes. He knelt down in front of them, bringing his large frame down to their level. The motion was clumsy, unfamiliar, but his intent was clear. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than Emma had ever heard it. "There's no trip. We're staying home." He looked at Sarah. "We will get your bear back, I promise." Sarah just stared at him, then her lower lip began to tremble. Thomas, ever the protector, put a small arm around his sister. Jack stood up and turned back to Emma. The moment of softness was gone, replaced by that chilling resolve. He walked past her to the window, to the very spot where she had stood in terror just minutes before. He looked down at the city, his city. His jaw was set, a line of granite. He pulled a trembling Emma into an embrace, turning her away from the window, shielding her from the view of the ledge and the empty space where the bear had been. He held her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head. He was a wall of muscle and resolve. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear. It was the sound of a promise. It was the sound of a war being declared. He looked out over her head at the sprawling metropolis below. "No one," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her, a promise made of iron and fire, "will ever make you run from me again. I swear it." The promise still hung in the air between them, a vow forged in steel and fear. Jack held Emma, his arms a fortress around her trembling frame. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of his making. For a long moment, he just held her, absorbing her terror, letting his own cold fury solidify into something sharp and precise. The city lights below seemed to mock them, a million indifferent eyes staring up at the single window where their world had just been shattered. He was the ghost, a man who moved through the city's shadows, untouchable. And Marcus Thorne had reached into his home and placed a child's toy on his balcony. Slowly, Jack released her. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but his eyes were chips of ice. He turned his head slightly. Leo Romano stood near the entrance to the living area, his expression grim, having witnessed the entire horrifying discovery. He had been waiting, a silent sentinel of bad news and loyal counsel. "Leo," Jack's voice was unnervingly quiet. It was the voice he used when contracts were signed and fates were sealed. "Use the accounts from the Gibraltar transfer, the ones we were holding. Begin the asset liquidation. Everything with Thorne's name on it, or the name of his shell corporations. I want him liquid by sunrise." Leo nodded once, his face impassive. And his partners? They'll get a call, Jack said, his gaze drifting back to Emma. She was watching him, her arms wrapped around herself, her knuckles white. She looked like a woman staring at two different monsters, the one outside the window and the one standing right in front of her. They'll be given a choice, a very simple one. They can sink with him or they can swim with us. He took a step toward Emma, and she flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that felt like a physical blow. He stopped. The space between them was a canyon of lost years and fresh terror. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, but the words felt like lies. He had brought this danger to her doorstep. His world had finally caught up to her. You and the children will not leave this floor, he stated, the words clipped and devoid of warmth. It was an order, but underneath it, she heard the desperate plea. My most trusted men will be outside the door. They will not enter. They are only there to ensure nothing and no one gets past them. Their names are Arthur and Paul. They have grandchildren of their own. He offered this last detail as a strange, clumsy peace offering, an attempt to make the guards seem less like jailers. Emma just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as Jack walked over to a small, secure desk in the corner of the room. He spoke quietly into a phone, his back to her. His posture was rigid, a monolith of controlled rage. She heard fragments of his conversation, words like logistics, leverage, and containment. It was the language of war, spoken with the dispassionate tone of a surgeon discussing an operation. She backed away slowly, her feet making no sound on the thick rug, and slipped into the hallway leading to the children's rooms. She peered into their doorway. Thomas and Sarah were sleeping soundly, oblivious. Sarah's remaining stuffed animals were piled around her. Thomas had one arm thrown over his head, his face serene. Their chests rose and fell in the soft light of a dinosaur-shaped nightlight. They were safe for now, but their safety was being purchased by a man she barely knew anymore. A man who spoke of destroying another human being as if he were discussing a business merger. For 7 years, she had run from this world. Now she was at its absolute center, praying for its king to be as ruthless as she'd always feared he was. The following days were a study in suspended animation. The penthouse became a silent, gilded bubble. Outside, a war was being waged without a single gunshot. Jack was a phantom, leaving before the children woke and returning long after they were asleep. Emma only knew he'd been there by the faint scent of his cologne in the hallway or the sight of a fresh suit jacket slung over a chair. The silence was the loudest thing in the apartment. It hummed with unspoken violence, with the immense unseen pressure he was exerting on the city below. Leo would appear once a day. He would knock softly on the door and speak to Emma with formal, deferential courtesy. His updates were sterile and brief. A major shipping container, owned by one of Thorne's front companies, had been indefinitely detained at the port due to an anonymous customs tip. A casino partner had abruptly sold his stake, causing a cascade of investor panic. A key political contact of Thorne's was suddenly under federal investigation. It was like watching a master chess player remove pieces from the board one by one. There was no blood, no overt conflict. There was only a quiet, systematic dismantling. Jack wasn't just attacking Marcus Thorne. He was erasing him from the landscape of power, turning his own infrastructure into a weapon against him. He was using the information provided by the traitor, Anthony Gallo, like a map to the foundations of Thorne's empire. And he was pulling them out, one by one, until the whole structure began to creak and groan, ready to collapse. Emma tried to build a routine, a fragile wall of normalcy against the encroaching chaos. She and the twins built elaborate forts out of sofa cushions. They had picnics on the living room floor. She read them stories, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. Sarah, ever perceptive, seemed to feel the tension. She was quieter than usual, often asking when the man with the sad eyes was coming home. He's very busy, sweetheart, Emma would say, smoothing her daughter's hair. Is he busy keeping the monsters away? Sarah asked one afternoon, her gray eyes, Jack's eyes, weaned and serious. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked from Sarah to Thomas, who was watching her with a silent, knowing intensity. They understood more than she gave them credit for. They had lived with a low hum of fear their entire lives. This was just a new, more luxurious version of it. Yes, baby, she whispered, her voice thick. That's exactly what he's doing. One evening, unable to sleep, she walked into the main living area. The city was a tapestry of glittering lights. She felt so small, so high above it all. She saw a file left on Jack's desk. It was open. She knew she shouldn't, but she was drawn to it. Inside was a single black and white photograph. It showed a man, slick and smiling, shaking hands with another, more nervous-looking man. Marcus Thorne, and beside him, Anthony Gallo, the man who had torn her life apart 7 years ago. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note from Leo. Gallo has gone to ground. He knows we know. He is waiting for the axe to fall. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. He was still out there. The man who had whispered those terrible lies in her ear, who had told her Jack was gone forever. The source of her nightmare. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. What would Jack do to him? The image of Jack's face when she had first spoken the name flashed in her mind, a face of cold, silent fury. She didn't know how long she stood there, but the sound of the elevator door opening made her gasp. Jack stepped into the penthouse. He looked like a ghost himself. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were hollowed out by exhaustion. He didn't seem to notice her at first. He walked to the bar, poured a measure of amber liquid into a glass, and drank it down in one smooth motion. Then he saw her. He froze, the glass still in his hand. Emma. The file, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pointed to the desk. Gallo, he's being handled, Jack said, his voice flat. He walked over to the desk and closed the file, a gesture of finality. He wasn't angry she had looked. He just seemed weary beyond words. How? She pressed, needing to know. How are you handling him? She was afraid of the answer, afraid it would be something she could never unhear, something that would forever define the man standing before her. Jack stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Some men don't deserve a quick death, Emma, he said finally, his voice low and raw. They deserve a long life, a long, empty life with nothing but their regrets for company. He didn't need to explain further. She understood. He wasn't going to kill him. He was going to erase him. It was a colder, more profound punishment than she could have imagined. And it was a demonstration of a kind of power he had never truly comprehended. The next 2 days passed in the same tense quiet. Then, on the third night, Jack didn't come home at all. Emma found herself pacing the vast apartment, the silence pressing in on her. She checked on the children a dozen times. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She kept looking at the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Part of her prayed for him to walk through it, safe. Another part of her was terrified of the man who would. Just after 2 in the morning, the phone in the living room rang. Its shrill sound was an assault on the silence. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stared at it, frozen. Arthur, the guard, had told her it was a secure internal line, that only Jack or Leo could call it. She crept towards it and picked it up with a trembling hand. Hello? Emma, it was Leo's voice, calm, measured, and tired. I apologize for the late hour. Jack asked me to call. He is on his way back. He is safe. Is it? She couldn't finish the sentence. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It is done, Leo said, and the simple words carried the weight of 100 battles. Marcus Thorne no longer has a foothold in this city. His organization is broken. He has been persuaded to retire permanently. Emma sank into a nearby chair, the receiver still pressed to her ear. Persuaded. It was such a clean, sterile word for what must have been a brutal, terrifying process. And Anthony Gallo, she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Another pause, this one longer. Mr. Gallo was given a one-way ticket to a place where his name means nothing. He was left with a single suitcase and the clothes on his back. His accounts have been emptied. His contacts have been warned. To everyone he ever knew, he simply ceased to exist. Jack wanted you to know. He wanted you to know that the man who hurt you will never be able to hurt anyone again. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. They weren't tears of joy or relief. They were something far more complicated. It was the grief for the 7 years she had lost. It was the terror of the power Jack wielded so effortlessly. and it was a strange, frightening flicker of gratitude. He had not just protected her, he had avenged her, in a way that was both terrible and complete. "Thank you, Leo," she managed to say. "He will be home within the hour," Leo said, and the line went dead. Emma didn't move for a long time. She sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the city. She thought about the young man she had loved, the one who gave her a silver locket and promised her a life away from all of this. He was gone. In his place was this man, this king in a glass tower, who could make other men disappear with a phone call. But he had done it for her, for Thomas, for Sarah. He had unleashed the monster to protect them. The question that echoed in the cavern of her heart was whether the monster could ever be put back in its cage. She was still sitting there when she heard the soft chime of the elevator, followed by the quiet click of the penthouse door. Jack stepped inside. He looked as if he had aged a decade in 3 days. His suit was rumpled, his face was pale with exhaustion, and there was a darkness in his eyes she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was the profound, soul-deep weariness of a man who has looked into the abyss and forced it to blink first. He saw her immediately, a small figure curled in the large armchair, illuminated by the single lamp she'd left on. Their eyes met across the vast, silent room. 1,000 questions hung in the space between them. "Are you hurt? Who did you have to become to do this? Can we ever come back from it?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. She clutched the silver locket that was hidden beneath her shirt, its cool metal a small, solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He didn't speak. He didn't walk towards her. Instead, he moved past her, his steps slow and heavy, towards the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city. He stood there for a long time, his hands braced on the cool glass, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't surveying his kingdom. He looked like a man staring at his own reflection in the dark, confronted by the cost of his victory. The city lights spread out below him, a silent, glittering testament to the power he had just consolidated. Not for ambition, but for them, for her. Finally, he pushed himself away from the glass and turned back to face her. The mask of the ghost was gone. All she saw was Jack, tired, broken, and victorious. His voice was heavy, thick with the finality of it all, a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet room. "It's over," he said. "He's gone. They're all gone." He walked past her to the window and looked down at the city, then turned back. "It's over," he said, his voice heavy with the finality of it. "He's gone. They're all gone." The words hung in the vast, silent room. They were a promise fulfilled, an iron door slammed shut on years of fear. Emma watched him, standing there with the city lights framing his silhouette. He looked exhausted, not with the weariness of a single battle, but with the bone-deep fatigue of a long, solitary war. The air between them was clean for the first time. There were no more shadows, no more unseen enemies lurking in the periphery. There was only Jack, and there was only her, and the quiet breathing of their children sleeping in the next room. She didn't know how long they stood like that. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had been left unsaid for 7 years. The city below continued its endless, sleepless hum. But up here in the glass tower that had once felt like a prison, time had stopped. Jack's shoulders, usually held so straight and unyielding, seemed to carry an immense weight. He had won. He had erased the threat. But he did not look like a victor. He looked like a man who had just returned from a place he never wanted to visit again. Finally, he moved. He walked to the bar, not with his usual decisive stride, but slowly, like a man testing the ground beneath his feet. He poured 2 glasses of water, his hands steady, but his movements deliberate. He brought one to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a spark of contact that was shockingly normal, devastatingly intimate. She followed him back to the windows. They stood side by side, looking out at the sprawling tapestry of light. It was the same view she had stared at with terror just days ago, but now it was only a view. The city was just a city. "After you left," he began, his voice low and raspy, barely disturbing the quiet. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Or after I thought you left. The world went gray. Everything lost its color. I poured all of that emptiness into the work, into this." He made a small gesture with his free hand, a gesture that encompassed the penthouse, the city, the empire. It was easy to be ruthless when there was nothing to lose. Every deal, every risk, it didn't matter. Because if I failed, what was the worst that could happen? I'd just be back where I started, alone. Emma listened, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. This was not the voice of Jack Costello, the ghost, the man who commanded loyalty and fear with a single look. This was the voice of the man she had loved, the one who used to trace the lines on her palm and talk about a future that had nothing to do with power or money. He took a slow breath. My father built this life. He passed it to me. The ring, the name, the responsibility. I was supposed to honor it, expand it, and I did. I became better at it than he ever was. Colder, more efficient. I built walls so high, no one could touch me. He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes, so often like chips of flint, were dark with a deep, ancient sorrow. And I sat inside those walls, night after night, in a fortress of my own making, and I had never been more of a prisoner. He paused, searching her face for something. Disgust? Pity? He found only stillness, a deep, unwavering attention. The day I saw you on that street, he continued, his voice cracking just once. It was like the sun came out for the first time in 7 years. It was blinding, and then I saw them. I saw Thomas. I saw my own eyes looking back at me. He looked down at the heavy gold ring on his finger, turning it slowly. This ring, it meant legacy, it meant power. But in that 1 second, staring at my son, it meant nothing. It was just an anchor, weighing me down. All I could think was, what have I done? What kind of world have I built for a child of mine to be born into? A single tear escaped his control, tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let her see it. He let her see the completed unraveling of the man everyone else feared. That fear I felt when Marcus put that bear on the balcony, he whispered. I've faced men with guns. I've walked into rooms knowing I might not walk out. That was nothing, business. But the thought of him getting near Sarah, near Thomas, near you, that wasn't fear, Emma. It was annihilation. It was the end of the world because you three, you're the only world that matters. The dam inside Emma, the one she had so carefully constructed over years of hardship and lonely nights, finally broke. It wasn't a violent crash, but a slow, quiet dissolving. The resentment for the life he lived, the terror of his world, the bitterness of her struggle. It all washed away, leaving only the raw, aching truth that had been buried underneath. She set her glass down on a nearby table. She stepped closer to him, into his space until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She raised a trembling hand, not to strike him, not to push him away, but to gently, tenderly, touch the faint scar on his jawline. Her fingers traced the hardened line of his skin, a testament to a life she could never truly understand, a life that had almost cost them everything. He flinched at her touch, his eyes closing for a brief second, as if her gentleness was more painful than any blow. I tried to hate you, Jack, she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. Every single day, for 7 years, I told myself I hated you. When I was working 2 jobs just to pay the rent, when Thomas was sick and I couldn't afford the good medicine, when Sarah would ask about her father and I had no answers. Hating you was my shield. It was the only thing that kept me going. It was easier than admitting how much I missed you. She let her hand fall from his jaw to his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its frantic, unsteady rhythm beneath her palm. I was so scared, she breathed. I ran to protect our baby. They told me you were gone. They told me I was next. Every knock on the door, every strange car on the street. I thought it was them. I lived in that fear for so long, it became a part of me. It's why I fought you when you brought us here. I saw this place, this power, and all I could see was a bigger target. She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out the delicate silver chain. The heart-shaped locket lay against her skin, warmed by her body. She held it out for him to see. It was tarnished, its surface dulled by time and wear. But I never got rid of this, she whispered. I couldn't. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hold it so tightly. It was the only proof I had that we were real, that the boy who gave this to me wasn't just a dream. Jack's gaze fell to the locket, then lifted back to her eyes. The pain and regret swimming in their depths were mirrored in his own. The space between them disappeared. He lowered his head and his lips found hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was soft and searching, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt from their shared tears, of regret, and of a fragile, impossible hope. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the quiet air. "I love you, Emma," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I never stopped. Even when I thought you were gone forever, I loved you." "I know," she whispered, and for the first time she truly did. "I love you too." They stood there, wrapped in a silence that was now comfortable, healing. The first pale fingers of dawn were beginning to stretch across the dark sky, painting the horizon in shades of soft gray and gentle pink. The city was waking up, but their world had finally found its peace. A small sound from the hallway broke the spell, a soft shuffle of feet. They turned together, their hands still linked. Thomas stood in the doorway of the living room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with one small fist. He was clutching a small, stuffed dinosaur. He blinked, his gaze moving from his mother to Jack and back again. He saw their linked hands. He saw the tear tracks on his mother's face. But he also saw the soft, peaceful smile she gave him. He saw the way the big, scary man looked at her with an expression he had never seen before. There was no fear in the room, no tension, only a strange, warm stillness. Thomas took a hesitant step forward, his gray eyes, so like his father's, wooing and observant. He looked at Jack, really looked at him, not as a stranger or a benefactor, but as the man who held his mother's hand. He took another step. Then, in a clear, quiet voice that cut straight to the heart of everything, he said, "Good morning, Dad." The word hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. Dad. Not boss, not Mr. Costello, not the ghost, Dad. All the power he had ever wielded, all the fear he had ever inspired, all the wealth he had amassed, it all turned to dust in the face of that one simple word. His carefully controlled composure shattered into a million pieces. His eyes welled up again, this time with a joy so profound it was painful. Before Jack could even react, Sarah appeared behind her brother, her chestnut hair a wild mess. She saw Thomas standing there, saw her parents together, and her face broke into a wide, sleepy grin. She didn't hesitate. She ran forward, a blur of pink pajamas, and wrapped her small arms tightly around Jack's leg, burying her face against the fine wool of his trousers. "Good morning, Dad," she echoed, her voice muffled by the fabric. Jack let out a choked sound, a laugh, and a scream all at once. He released Emma's hand and knelt, bringing himself down to their level. He looked from Sarah's trusting face to Thomas's quiet, steady gaze. He reached out and pulled Thomas into his arms, then shifted to scoop Sarah up as well. He held them both against his chest, burying his face in their hair, breathing in the simple, perfect scent of his children. They were real. They were his. He stood up, one child held securely in each arm. They felt solid, warm, and impossible.